Thanks very much, Sarah. Delighted to speak to you today, and thanks for the opportunity. And I'm aware that people come from very different backgrounds. And what I'm going to try and say, I think, is applicable to everybody in life, because I've actually called this talk "Why Risk is Life." Because generally, when you handle risk in a corporate environment, it is very boring. Risk committees and people fall asleep, but they shouldn't be. So what I wanted to do is try and bring it to life for you. I mean, risk simply means that we're not sure what will happen in the future. If you knew everything about the future, you wouldn't have any risk. However, if you're mortal like the rest of us, you're constantly wrestling with what might or might not happen in the future. That's risk. Then you think about what you might do to influence or respond to that future event, and that's risk management. And that's all there is to it. Risk management isn't about having a risk committee or filling out risk reports. It's just life. When you lie in bed in the morning and it's foggy and frosty, you do a risk analysis in your head. Shall I get up and stay in the warm? Would the boss be upset if I were late for an important meeting? Maybe take the car, as the train is often late, but then driving in poor weather may be dangerous. So you can see that every day you weigh up risks. Sometimes you do it in an instant, but you're still going through a process. Now, some risks are bigger than others. We talked about getting up in the morning, but we also know that governments were ill prepared for the COVID pandemic. Now, here's a quote I'm going to give you with what a government source told the Times. The reason we prepared for flu is because we have flu epidemics every year. The idea that you prioritize what's least likely to happen is for the birds. This was a novel virus. The clue's in the name. We didn't know that it was asymptomatic. It's very difficult to prepare for something that doesn't exist. And that is a classic statement of somebody who doesn't know anything about risk. Where do we start? I mean, why would you prioritize something that's unlikely to happen? Well, probably because although it's unlikely, the consequences would be really bad and you want to be prepared. Why do you buy insurance on your house burning down? It's very uncommon, but the consequences are pretty nasty, so you buy insurance. Is it difficult to prepare for something that doesn't exist? No, it isn't. You just have to use your imagination, and maybe that's beyond this government, but we need to do it in our life. So I'm going to tell you what I think typically goes wrong with risk management. One, we prepare only for events that happened recently. How often have you heard someone dismissing something as a 1 in 100-year event? That's code for don't bother your pretty little head about it. But if you live, let's say you live for 80 years, the chances are extremely high that you'll live through a 1 in 100-year event. But then, of course, in any case, we underestimate rare events. You all here have lived through a 1 in 100-year pandemic and a 1 in 100-year financial crisis, both in the last 15 years. Uncommon events are much more common than you think. Two, we prioritize the most likely risk, not the most deadly. Likely risks may well have already happened. That's the clue is in the name likely. So you probably have some measure of mitigation and tolerance. For example, you probably have some resistance to flu, having got it 2 years ago. People tend to be dismissive of rarer but deadlier risks because they haven't yet happened or they happened a long time ago. But if they do, and you are ill prepared, the result can be devastating, such as the pandemic and the credit crunch. Number three, we focus on how an event might happen rather than the event itself. People tend to become distracted by thinking through what might happen and pontificating or assessing often completely unknowable probabilities. For example, instead of thinking about the consequences of a pandemic in general, the government decided to think only about flu. This meant that they focused on infection by contact instead of imagining ways to handle an airborne pandemic. Failure of imagination. You should start by thinking about an event happening, say the closure of your head office, and only then think about how this might happen, e.g. a pandemic or a terrorist threat or an aircraft landing on top of your office. So start with the event. Consider it in the context of trying to avoid that risk, not trying to assess the likelihood or to close down any further discussion. So focus on thinking it might happen. What do I do? Not, I think it's a 1 in 98 year event. It probably won't happen. Focus initially on events that might be triggered, such as a closure of an office, social isolation, elevated mortality, or an economic downturn, rather than whether the cause would be flu or a novel virus, for example. Number 4, we focus on the risk, not the consequences. Thinking through the consequences is pretty unpleasant, but actually extremely valuable, because you need to be planning to mitigate the worst results. Yet, we tend to concentrate on actions that reduce the possibility of the risk materializing. Yes, that's important, but we must still focus on the mitigations we need to take if that event actually happens. So think about the worst case and think what you would do. Don't just dismiss it as unlikely to happen. And then finally, we don't think through all the possibilities. It is so often the risk you didn't think of that will really hit you. For example, the financial crisis was made of the 2007 and 8 was made exponentially worse when banks wouldn't lend to other banks and investors didn't even want AAA rated paper. Most people had just thought a credit crunch as bad as that was simply inconceivable. And I'm not exaggerating, that's what they did think. The traditional company way of thinking about risks, it's appalling. We tend to specify a risk, let's say food contamination, and then we work out how we'll avoid it, usually by forming a committee and then deciding the committee will be so good it won't ever happen. A good risk process will take an event such as, say, a contaminated production run and look at how that might be caused and what the consequences would be. It then puts up barriers to try to stop this happening, to try to stop the contamination, but also how to react to block the damage if contaminated food is ultimately sent out. You can't just assume the event will never happen. So, for example, a key event in contamination risk ought to be briefing executives on how to talk to the media if you've accidentally poisoned somebody, because that's the sort of precaution you want. Now, a good way to remind yourself of all of this is the slogan, avoid, trap, mitigate. So let's talk through that. Avoid means envisage the event and then work out how you can put roadblocks in the way to try and stop it happening. This is what traditionally risk management calls mitigation. For example, the best way to handle theft as a risk is to deter it in the first place. A lot of what retail units do is trying to deter you from shoplifting, because that's much better than having to catch you afterwards. Similarly, the main role in airline security is not to spot terrorists. I assure you, I've worked in an airline. The main role of airline security is to deter them from even turning up. That's why it's often so unpleasant and so obvious to you, because it's a deterrence. So that's avoid. We've then got trap. People often forget that you can't manage an event if you don't know it's happening. Make sure you've got information systems or people to tell you and spot emerging events. For example, one reason why Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island nuclear accidents happened was because the operators couldn't understand the information they were getting, and they just didn't know what was happening. When I worked for Mars in the chocolate industry, we used to eat the previous day's production in the office. Now, you might think that's quite a perk, but I assure you, well, it was a perk, yeah, okay. But it was a deal. We knew what the chocolate tasted like, So if there was anything funny, the people in the office would spot it. So you got the chocolate for free, but you would spot it, and the production wouldn't leave the factory until the office had eaten a good portion of it. And let me tell you, that worked. Real examples of where somebody said, it's got a bit of a metallic taste. Oh, and we found that it was a contamination. So that's avoid, trap, now mitigate. Mitigate the consequence. That is often dismissed because too many risks we assume will never happen because we've got such good reasons to stop it. We've got a committee that reviews it, so we know it won't happen. Right. In 2008, Northern Rock, as Sarah's just mentioned, knew that if it ran out of liquidity, like any bank, the Bank of England would act as lender of last resort. That sounds like a great event. The problem, a great mitigation, the problem was that somebody hadn't thought about the fact that somebody would leak this, and then the BBC would blaze it across the 10 o'clock news, which would then cause a run. So the mitigation actually wasn't good enough, or at least having it opened up another risk. So avoid, trap, mitigate. The other tip I want to give you is what I call specific walkthroughs. Another time, I was in the boardroom of a very large professional company, listening to an executive explaining how they were completely prepared for any IT outage because they had a full backup system. The main computer center had regular backups onto tape that were then biked to another office 100 miles away. It was very unlikely to be needed anyway because the data center could withstand an earthquake and had sprinkler systems against fire. So why are you worried? Why are you worried, boys? It'll never happen. So I asked, what would happen to the data center if the sprinklers went off? Because they would be showering the servers with water, which you'll probably know is not a great idea. Then I said, so what happens to backups? Apparently, they're driven to another office and stored. Okay, then I said, how would you mount the disks? And what hardware and software would run the backups to restore all the systems? And there was that horrible silence you sometimes get in a board meeting where you've asked the question they hadn't thought of. Of course, they hadn't got any systems to run it. The backup was useless. And of course, they'd never been able to test it. It's the sort of thing you get by asking the balls aching detailed, just run me through exactly what would happen there. Imagine if an aircraft, a pilot's manual just said in its disaster section, and I assure you pilots' manuals do have a disaster section, it just said monitor and manage the flight computers and identify abnormalities. Not specific enough. That's the sort of nonsense that you get a better answer by saying, just walk me through exactly how it would happen. So, tips from me. 1, treat every decision as a risk. Always think what's the best and the worst that can happen. 2, think about how you can avoid that risk happening. By far the best outcome is to avoid. Don't discourage the thief, the terrorist. Thirdly, ask how you would ensure that you know the risk is happening. Who's going to tell me that something is going wrong? And who will be able to interpret the information? 4, think what would you do if that risk does happen? Yes, go through it. Even though you think it's unlikely, go through it. And then take yourself through every step of your mitigation plans. So what would happen then? Who would do this? And then finally, take every mitigation plan that you've got that uses the following words: manage, review, monitor, ensure, committee, and throw them all out. Replace them with sentences that are action specific, such as, if this happens, I will do that. Specificity is everything in risk management. Now, there's much more on my website about risk and in my book, Behind Closed Doors. Today, I just want to emphasize to you that risk isn't something to delegate to the risk committee. It's not a report to fill out. It's how we live our lives. You can't talk about strategy on the one hand and risk on the other, because they are exactly the same thing. If you want to invest in new plant or buy something, you need to weigh up the certainties, such as the purchase price, against the uncertainties, the upside and the downside, the sales, the management, the risk. That's how you make the decision. And it's just the same as how you decided whether to get up this morning or whether even to stay in bed. It's exactly the same thing. Thanks.